Hey everybody, join me as I take a deep dive into another Stephen King classic. In this segment I call SK Reviews. Warning, there will be spoilers ahead. Alright, listen up, you cockadoodie brats. In this video, I'm gonna be talking about misery, and there's nothing you can do to stop me, you dirty birdies, so you just sit down and you just listen! You just listen to what I have to say about misery! So a little bit of background about Misery. It was originally slated to be a Bachman book before Bachman died of cancer of the pseudonym in 1985. And honestly, I think if Thinner really pushed the envelope on the secret of Bachman's identity, Misery would have blown it wide open. I mean, the final version of the book that has Stephen King's name on it mentions things like Sidewinder, Colorado, and even the Overlook Hotel. I doubt that those things would have been mentioned in the Bachman version, but if they had been, it would have been game over for Richard Bachman. The book is dedicated to Stephanie and Jim Leonard with the literal quote, "This is for Stephanie and Jim Leonard who know why. Boy, do they." So Stephanie was Tabitha's sister and served for some time as Stephen King's private secretary. Together with her husband Jim, they founded the Castle Rock newsletter. So they had firsthand knowledge of King's fans and how strange they could be. So as much as Stephen King says and has said that he's not Paul Sheldon, the parallels are really hard to miss. So in the novel Misery, Paul Sheldon feels chained to the romance genre, even though he fancies himself a serious writer, a serious artist at heart. And in Stephen King's life, in 1984, he had published The Eyes of the Dragon on his own private Philtrum press label. And fan reaction to that was surprised and even hurt and a bit negative because it wasn't like a normal Stephen King book, whatever that means. Well, we all know what it means. It means horror. It wasn't horror. It wasn't what fans were expecting. And they expressed their frustration and disappointment. So I think Stephen King also was probably feeling a little chained to the horror genre by this point in the mid-80s. And then the reaction to Misery was also pretty unsurprisingly hurt and negative. While people, I think, admitted and understood that it was a brilliant work overall, the depiction of an artist or an author's relationship with their fans was highly unflattering. And I admit, as somebody who talks about Stephen King at length, some might say ad nauseum, I had a few moments of guilt when revisiting Misery, thinking about Stephen King the man, not Stephen King the brand, but Stephen King the man, which I am sometimes guilty of losing sight of. So Misery was part of Stephen King's massive drug-fueled early to mid-80s output, which included in 1984 alone, The Talisman with Peter Straub, Eyes of the Dragon on the Philtrum label, and Thinner, the final Bachman book before Bachman was outed. 1985 release was Skeleton Crew, which was mostly old stories and had some new ones thrown in. 1986 saw the release of the behemoth 1100 plus page novel, It. And then in 1987, Stephen King released 3 novels, Dark Tower 2, The Drawing of the Three, The Tommyknockers, and of course, Misery. So 1984, 5, 6, 7. In 4 years, that is 8, oh my God, 8 books, including one collection, which maybe doesn't count quite so much, but including also one of Stephen King's very longest books of his entire career. So it was a massive creative push. And I would say that none of those books are duds. They all have redeeming qualities. So it was also an unparalleled and unprecedented period of creative energy and output from King. And it's no wonder that after the publication of Tommyknockers, he kind of burned out a bit. I'm amazed he was able to accomplish as much as he was. So in publication order, in 1987, Misery came before the Tommyknockers, and Misery is often considered the end of Stephen King's quote-unquote classic period. Even though the Tommyknockers came out in the same year, it is often considered a flawed work, and Misery, so the period of 1974 with Carrie through 1987, the publication of Misery, and completely ignoring the Tommyknockers, that is considered Stephen King's classic period. So Misery, I think, sums up where Stephen King had been, while also neatly forecasting where Stephen King was going in his work in the 90s. There's lots of interesting details in Misery about the process of creating and writing while just stoned out of your mind. And in a foreshadow of Stephen King's later accident, writing while in extreme pain. And it's obvious that writing is Paul's ultimate drug, and by proxy, Stephen King's as well. The hole in the page that he continually references makes me think of the hole in the arm if you're injecting a drug into your vein. And when that hole in the page opens up, everything else falls away. Paul's ultimate trip, his ultimate drug, is writing. And I found that very provocative, a comparison to Stephen King's own life and process, especially at that time. So Annie Wilkes is drugs. Stephen King has stated on multiple occasions that Annie Wilkes was his drug problem personified, and that unlike when he wrote Jack Torrance in The Shining, whose alcoholism mirrored King's own, but King expressed that he didn't know, or he didn't realize the parallels to his own life. He said he knew exactly what he was doing when he wrote Annie in Misery. Drugs were his number one fan and never wanted to leave his side. And after the massive bulk of it, with parallel storylines spanning multiple generations and a huge cast of characters, by comparison, Misery seems almost stripped to the bone. And in fact, Stephen King would revisit this idea about 5 or 6 years later with Gerald's Game. But after the huge bulk of it, Misery is basically one setting, mostly a room in a house, but the rest of the house comes into play as well. One setting with 2 characters. It's a huge challenge, and it could have failed miserably, but Stephen King does a great job, I think, of pulling off this literary challenge. And it's exciting to read it, and it's exciting to read him challenging himself and then rising to that challenge. So what doesn't work? I mean, honestly, not much. I would consider Misery to be an absolute Stephen King classic. If there was an element of Misery that maybe doesn't work quite so well, it does have some pacing issues. So after the mid-novel climax of the hobbling scene, the one that once you read it or see it in the movie, you never ever forget it. Like prior to that, there had been an actual energy building up of Paul's planning and scheming to escape. And you're really, really rooting for him because, of course, Annie is terrifying and she is highly violent and threatening to Paul's very existence. So you're pulling for this guy to escape. And it all builds up. And then the hobbling scene, this bubble of energy, this bubble of momentum just bursts. You realize Paul was never going to get away. Everything that he was thinking in his head, all of his plans and schemes amounted to nothing. Annie was onto him the entire time. And Paul, in his head, he breaks. That scene and the aftermath breaks Paul, and that impacts the pacing somewhat of the novel. It loses that energy and it loses that momentum that it had, and it does build the momentum back up, but it's in a much bleaker and more desperate feeling than it had in the first part of the novel. And another thing that maybe doesn't work so well, although I come to appreciate it more and more as the novel progresses, are the lengthy breakaways to the actual novel within the novel that Paul is writing. Although I come to understand and appreciate and look forward to those as a break from the monotony and the tension and the stress of Paul's existence in that one room with Annie, the goddess, looming just off screen at all times. At first, it is a bit jarring because the vignettes from the novel within the novel can be pretty lengthy. And so you're reading and you're like, but what about the guy in the room? I thought I was reading about the guy in the room. I don't care about this as much as I care about the guy in the room. But then the breakaways, as the novel's progressing, you start to see the parallels that Paul adds in to the novel that reference his life and his existence with Annie. And she is just too thick to make the connection. Or at least you hope she is, because if she does make the connection, it probably won't end well for Paul Sheldon. So what does work? This is a much longer list. Again, I mentioned the stripped down setting. I would put that as number one. It's really, really interesting and exciting to read a novel where Stephen King is so obviously challenging himself with such a limited setting. He's putting in a bunch of limitations. It reminds me of Alfred Hitchcock in Rear Window. He's going to have a movie where the entire movie took place in one apartment. Or then before that even, he had his movie Lifeboat, where the entire movie took place amongst shipwreck survivors in a lifeboat. It's really, really exciting to see a master of their craft challenge themselves, set limitations that they have to overcome, and then overcome them in such fine fashion. Stephen King manages to overcome the limitations of the setting by having lots and lots of those famous Stephen King internal monologues, those things that make his novels so hard to effectively adapt for the screen. So much of them take place in the minds of the characters. And of course, Paul's mind drifts and wanders, and he takes us right along with him. And then, of course, as I mentioned, one of the things that doesn't work in the beginning are the breakaways to the misery novel within the novel. But eventually, those become welcome respites from the day-to-day monotony and slog of what Paul is actually experiencing. And I really started to look forward to them. And speaking of the novel within the novel, one thing that I really appreciate and was impressed by in this revisit of Misery was, I don't know why it never occurred to me before, but Stephen King had to basically plot and conceive both novels simultaneously, even though the novel within the novel isn't complete. There are segments and snippets that are shown in the main novel. Stephen King had to, in the back of his mind, think about those characters, identify them, conceive of their motivations, and also progress that story as well. I think that's a really impressive feat, and I really enjoyed it. And thanks to the movie, the very, very excellent movie adaptation of Misery, there are some very famous set piece scenes that Stephen King included in his novel that are now part of the pop culture language. So the first one of these is the burning of the manuscript scene. And this is incredibly painful, and it's a first glimpse of Annie's just depthless cruelty and manipulation to force Paul to destroy this thing that he spent months and months of his life creating for the release of his pain medication. Probably the most famous set piece from Misery, from the book and the movie, is the infamous hobbling scene, although it is much grislier in the novel than in the movie. Like I mentioned before, all of the planning and scheming of Paul in the first half of the novel, and Stephen King just so brilliantly and seamlessly just weaves this tapestry of revelation that Annie knew everything that Paul was doing, and then assumed more so the entire time, and everything comes crashing down in Paul's world. And you know that Annie's plotting something, and you know it's going to be terrible, but you don't. Stephen King, he builds the momentum and the tension in the scene, and you know something's coming, but he keeps it just off screen until right before it actually happens, building the dread and the tension, and it's just brilliant the way he pulls it off. And then, I don't remember, because it's been years since I've seen the movie, I don't remember if this is in the movie or just in the novel, but the thumbectomy. It's not too long. It's in kind of the the aftermath of the emotional climax of the hobbling scene that Stephen King just casually drops that Annie severed one of Paul's thumbs. And I was like, did I miss something? What the heck was that? I even rewound or reversed the audiobook so I could listen to that part again. And it's just, it's Paul's day to day, and he's writing and blah, 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 and he's taking his medicine. And oh, by the way, Annie cut off one of his thumbs and he doesn't have much of an appetite. And you're just like, what the heck was that? This truly reflects Paul's broken mental state and his encroaching insanity. Annie cutting off Paul's thumb is almost treated as an afterthought, but it does lead to a brilliant and demented, although somewhat out of place, set piece involving a birthday cake. Paul did so much leading to the loss of his foot, and it's revealed that just one offhand comment leads to the loss of his thumb. This is both, I think, dwelled on too much and not enough. And this might be a misstep in the overall flow of the novel. All of the things that Paul did that led to the loss of his foot. And then it's like Stephen King had an idea. He had a demented idea for a birthday cake with a thumb candle right in the middle. And he just found a way to kind of shoehorn that idea into the novel. I'm not saying that it doesn't work, but it is a bit jarring and a bit out of place. It's a bit too maybe on the nose horror carnival funhouse and kind of draws you out of the story. But then counterpoint to that, I recognize that that scene and the removal of the thumb and the birthday cake and all of that, it speaks to Annie's insanity, but it's also indicative of her trying to regain the upper hand, no pun intended, in their relationship.
And now a word about our sponsor.
Since 2001, The Collector has been a cornerstone resource of the Stephen King collecting community, providing information about remarks, manufacturing and selling slipcases to protect your cherished titles, providing forums where you can connect with like-minded collectors, and providing information about all the books a collector could possibly be interested in, from limited editions to first editions and all the other editions to boot. Additionally, The Collector provides up-to-the-minute information and exciting news about everything Stephen King, collected from all over the internet. StephenKingCollector.com. Go check it out. You'll be glad you did.
So one of the big things that does work is Annie Wilkes herself, Annie Wilkes as a character. She's one of the classic, iconic SK villains. She's a real person. She's fully fleshed out. She has a backstory. You understand something about her motivations. She's absolutely terrifying and unpredictable. Stephen King has a long history with supernatural elements in his novels and supernatural villains like Pennywise or Randall Flagg, who, while terrifying, are fundamentally other than the human beings that they terrorize. Well, Annie Wilkes, in my book, is probably the single scariest non-supernatural villain in the entire Stephen King universe. The scene where Paul leaves the bedroom and he finds her scrapbook and he learns her backstory is completely and utterly chilling. You know where it's going to go. And Stephen King is building up, ratcheting up the tension that she might come back anytime. She could come back any minute, put the scrapbook away and leave. But Paul can't stop flipping the pages. Paul can't stop reading and learning more and more about Annie. And we're right there with him. So Annie's mental illness or mental illness says, I debated whether or not to put this maybe in the what doesn't work category. Annie is terrifying and unpredictable, which is very effective. And even more terrifying are the scenes where she shuts down and becomes catatonic because you don't know when she's going to come back. It's like when she's off screen or she's left the house and Paul is doing something he shouldn't be doing and you never know when she's going to come back. It's like that, except she's in the room like a statue, which is even scarier in my opinion. You never know when she's going to come back and what she's going to do when she does. However, I think Annie has so many overlapping mental illnesses that it almost undermines her as a character. She she has all of the things. So it justifies in the novel any behavior, any strange, peculiar, bizarre behavior that she may manifest can be explained away by yet another mental illness. And in fact, I looked up a list of the mental illnesses of Annie Wilkes, and I have it here. I'm going to quote from it so I don't mess up. So according to Google, Annie has borderline personality disorder. She has extreme mood swings and paranoia. She also has schizoid, schizotypal, and obsessive compulsive features. She has bipolar disorder. She has severe mood swings and depressive episodes that can last for days. She has psychosis, which she masks with a friendly and perky personality, unless it's not. And finally, she has psychopathy. She's brutal, devious, and cunning. She also has sadomasochistic features. So she has all of the things, essentially all of the things all at once. And that makes her terrifying, but it also makes her a bit more of like a two-dimensional, all-purpose boogeyman than an actual person. So Misery is another story about a writer and the process of writing. And in Stephen King's long career, he has tackled this subject many, many, many times. I'm not going to say countless. I'm sure it could be counted, but the number of characters in his stories that are either authors or the novel itself is about an author and the process of writing, legion. There are so many. And Misery may be the ultimate statement on that topic. Arguably, no other Stephen King work so deeply delves into the relationship between the author and their fans, the author and the work that they create, the author and their characters, and between the author and outside factors like drugs. Misery has a lot of really interesting things to say about the simultaneous joy and loathing that artists like authors may feel when they create things that are successful and popular, but they feel like they're not taken seriously as artists, and they feel like they are capable of so much more. So Stephen King himself very plainly stated that when he started out, he had purely commercial intentions. In fact, he was very poor, and so writing stories, knocking them out, whatever was popular, whatever would sell, was his primary motivating factor. And the money he got went to very, very practical needs in his real everyday life. He had no idea or aspirations that his work would be conceived as art. But this obviously changed as Stephen King progressed throughout his career. I think at this point, Stephen King has struck a happy balance where he can publish whatever he wants and people accept it as a Stephen King work. He is no longer, I don't think anyway, in my estimation, is he branded the king of horror. He's just Stephen King, a very, very famous and very popular writer. And most people understand that he publishes a wide variety of things, usually with elements of horror, but often with so much more to offer. So in Misery, Paul's novel, Fast Cars, if Paul is an analog for Stephen King himself, Fast Cars speaks to that idea that Stephen King he knew he was capable of serious work that would be taken seriously, and his deep desire to write something serious. But ironically, once Paul really throws himself into the work of writing the new Misery novel, the novel within the novel, he enjoys it so much, and he realizes unironically that it's probably the best thing that he's ever written. And I think one of the few, but one of the happy endings, the rays of light at the end of Misery, is that Paul seems to have come to terms with that and seems to be more okay with it. Misery has a lot of really unflattering things to say about the demands of fans. Fans feel entitled or like this extreme sense of ownership. And this is personified in Annie's extreme behavior demanding that Paul write a novel just for her in an edition of only one because she's his biggest fan and she deserves that. And all of this, from Annie's perspective, is done with a sense of love and worship. And it's really interesting to see it through Stephen King's eyes, to see it from the author's perspective. So finally, the idea of Paul as Stephen King. I've talked about this throughout this video, and while he, at the time and later, has explicitly distanced himself from this idea that he and Paul are the same, or Paul is autobiographical. It's hard to fully accept that idea because there are so many subtle or implicit or outright explicit connections between Stephen King and Paul Sheldon. And the metaphor of Stephen King as Paul, or Paul as Stephen King, is not subtle in Misery. So it's hard to believe Stephen King when he says that he and Paul were not intended to be the same person. It's not subtle, and it's really easy to understand why fans were so hurt and upset when the novel first came out. These seeming autobiographical elements, I think, add a real richness to the novel that just casual fans of Stephen King may miss, but for the more dyed-in-the-wool constant reader fan, I think it adds a lot of emotion to the process of reading the novel, which I think makes it a better experience overall. And Misery gives some of the greatest glimpses into the creative process of any Stephen King work. He's talked about this many, many times, and I think Misery is, again, probably the ultimate statement on this topic. And it seems to answer some of the lasting questions that I had about Stephen King's personal drug use and its impact on his creativity. It strains credulity a little bit that Paul remains so sharp and able to keep working on the novel despite the extreme pain and the drug dependency that he was going through at the time. But this would have seemed perfectly normal to Stephen King, whose own chemical dependency did not hinder his output at the time at all, seemingly. It only enhanced it, at least in terms of volume, if not quality. There's a passage from Misery that speaks to this really well. It says, Paul's creativity was the toughest, most lasting thing in his life, and no drug or drink had ever polluted it. Nothing had ever been able to pollute that crazy well of dreams. And the big emotion that I feel when I think about that statement is one of gratitude that we all kind of dodged a bullet. It's easy to imagine anybody falling victim to drug and drink and excess and just losing their creative thread, losing their ability to create anything of worth. But we're all very fortunate that Stephen King's well of dreams was built of much stouter stuff. I also have to talk about Annie's vocabulary. I love Annie's vocabulary and the Annieisms that King sprinkles throughout the book. I think Stephen King does a great job using language as a barometer for Annie's mood. And even though she's so violent and so crazy, her language remains almost demure throughout the novel, even almost shy, even when she's upset. And then, so by the end of the novel, one of the things that happens is that Annie starts speaking in unvarnished, undiluted streams of real profanity. And it's terrifying because you know that means that she's officially gone over the edge. She has lost all semblance of restraint and control. So I made a list of my favorite Annieisms, and I'm going to read them now. Mr. Man, oh poop, effing pig feed, bitchly cow corn, Christing earmite medicine, big bastard of a check, cockadoodie medication, dirty bird, fiddledy foof, cock-a-poopy doopy, get up to dittos, you bet your Rudy patooties I had, and finally, cockadoodie bumhole. I think if everyone stopped whatever they were doing once a day and just yelled, cockadoodie bumhole, at the top of their voice, it would be a great way to relieve tension and stress. Anyway, there's also a bunch of Easter eggs in Misery, and I think as a reward to the constant reader, I really get a kick out of these. So the location of the novel, Sidewinder, Colorado, the famous or infamous setting of The Shining. Paul writes his novels in Boulder, just like Stephen King did when he wrote The Shining and The Stand. Paul was 24 when he sold his first novel, just like Stephen King. Paul's childhood memory of his mother going to Boston with Mrs. Casbrack. Mrs. Casbrack is a name from It. The artist and the young artist in the novel, Pomeroy, he was going to go up to that old hotel and sketch the ruins. which is an explicit reference to The Shining. Again, if this novel with that content had been published under the Bachman name, it would have been complete game over for Richard Bachman, because it would have been just too obvious. There's a reference to the overlook to that old hotel, that the caretaker had burned it down, that he was crazy, he, of course, being Jack Torrance. And in the novel, Paul's agent's name is Charlie Merrill, and Stephen King's real-life agent at this time was Charlie Verrill. All of these Easter eggs, they wouldn't maybe mean anything to casual readers, and it wouldn't matter. The book would still be enjoyable, but I sure get a kick out of stuff like that. So I wanted to share that list with you in this video. So wrapping up, Misery marks the end of Stephen King's so-called classic period, which extended from 1974 to the middle of 1987 when he published Misery. This period is the cornerstone of his reputation to this day. The novel features one of King's greatest villains, a claustrophobic setting, a harrowing premise, and deeply autobiographical reflections on art and the process of creating art and the relationship between artists, authors, and fans. Misery is a desert island Stephen King book. It's iconic and utterly indispensable, and I give it a 10 out of 10. So let me know in the comments, what's your take on Misery? Is it iconic and indispensable, or is it overrated? What are your thoughts? What are your takeaways? I love reading what you have to say. Anyway, thank you as always to channel sponsor Thomas over at the Stephen King Collector website. And thanks as always to you, the viewers who support me and who support the channel. I really, really appreciate it. And wherever you are, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will talk to you later. Bye.